And so there's two narratives going on right now. There's a narrative within Islam that is struggling to figure out, who are we? What does Islam stand for? What do we represent? That's why I say they're in the midst of an identity crisis. And I think there's a narrative going on within the Christian church that says God has a great love for the Muslim world, and he desires that Muslims would know him and worship him, and he wants us to go out and represent the love of Christ to Muslims in the world. And then there's another narrative that says, get them out of our country. You can't trust a Muslim. They are all fill in the blank. And so what do? We first of all recognize that there is an identity crisis within Islam. There are those that want to say Islam is a religion of peace, and then there are those that want to say that God has called us to take over the world by force. And so there's two stories going on in the Muslim world, and we're not sure which one to believe. Unfortunately, I find that most Christians tend to side with the radicals, which I find bizarre. Instead of siding with those that are about peace, thinking that they could do their best to be at peace with people, they side with radicals. It's not the first time that there's been public narratives that are concerning. There's a public narrative within this last century that was also concerning. Some of you probably recognize this photo from Norman Rockwell's collection. He's a narrative painter, and there's a lot going on in the photo, but this is the desegregation of schools. And there's a young girl there that probably doesn't know a whole lot about the history of what's been going on and why there's so much hatred and violence. She's just kind of stuck in the middle. And it's a pretty embarrassing time for our country, looking backwards. And I feel like that historians are probably going to look back at this time in our history and feel similarly that people felt so negatively about an entire group of people. And I hope that it's not the church that gets associated with the hate that goes on, because I think that there are a lot of young Muslims out there and a lot of older Muslims out there, a lot of Muslim women, a lot of Muslim men that are some of the most kind, loving people I've ever met. And I think they're being categorized and pigeonholed into groups that we can justifiably hate. That should concern us. A lot of it comes from the media. We hear things like 10% of the Muslim world are terrorists, and if there are 167 million terrorists out there, then you should be afraid. 167 million terrorists, I mean, that's insane. The bottom line is it's just not true. It's an inflated statistic. There's never been any research whatsoever to demonstrate that there's 10% of the Muslim world that represents terrorism. It's not even close to 1%. If you take all of the terrorist attacks and you add them all up together and get the statistics going, let's just say, for instance, let's look at some of the math here. If there are 10% of the Muslims terrorists, we have 167 million terrorists. In 2013, there were 10,000 terrorist attacks, most of which happened in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Iraq. So of those 10,000 attacks, 17,000 people died. It's not to minimize that. That's a large number, most of which were Muslim. Now, let's assume that in each of these terrorist attacks, there were 100 radical Muslims involved, even though we know statistically it usually is carried out by 2 or 3. Let's make it 100, just so that nobody can say we're not giving the full truth. If we multiplied those 9,000 attacks by 100, we would still end up with less than, 900,000? That's not even a million. That's a far cry from 160 million. But it doesn't necessarily help us feel better. In fact, Islamic terrorism expert Peter Bergen, who spent probably more time than anybody amongst the radicals and the terrorists, suspects that there's about 0.1% of the Muslim world is terrorist. But for some reason, when somebody says it in the news, we just think, well, it's probably right. 160 million terrorists, that's a lot. It's just not true. And then it was later said, well, Muslims are angry towards our government, and so we should be afraid of them as well. But the research actually shows that Muslims are more satisfied that live in this country. Muslims that live in this country are more satisfied with their government than you or I. Muslims have a higher satisfaction rate of the way government works in politics than the average American. But we're afraid of them. A friend shared with me a story last week about how he sold a car to a Muslim guy that was broken down. The Muslim guy said he was going to replace the engine and all of this stuff, and he got the opportunity to get to know this guy, have tea with him. I mean, this doesn't happen when you sell a used car with most people, but he had tea with him, shared a meal with him, got to hear about his family, said that he was one of the nicest men he's ever encountered. And when he was sharing his testimony at church about how God provided someone to buy his car, and it was a Muslim, and he was able to sit with him and share the love of Jesus with him through conversation and food, as he was done sharing, the person sitting across from him said, "Yeah, but did it ever occur to you that you probably just sold a car that's going to be used as a bomb?" Where do we get this stuff? Well, we're inundated with fear. We are literally terrified. And we have to recognize that not all Muslims are like that. And so statistics, unfortunately, they really don't change things. Let me give you an example. I used to know the statistical probability of being struck by lightning. And that was because growing up surfing in Florida, there was a lot of lightning, and I never wanted to get out of the water. And so lightning would come, people would leave the water, and I'd say, "Do you guys recognize how unlikely it would be that you're struck by lightning?" And I would quote statistics because they made me feel better until I was struck by lightning. And there was 3 of us, and we were in a river, and the lightning came, and I explained to these guys about how the statistical probability of us being struck by lightning were virtually nil, and there was no need for us to get out of the river. And then lightning struck the water right in front of us and scared me probably more than I've ever been scared in my entire life. I thought I was dead. And you better believe when lightning even creeps along the horizon, I am the first one out of the water. There will be a wake behind my kayak, if I'm in a kayak, of me heading out of the water, because experience tends to trump statistics. And we experienced something on 9/11. And we experience something daily in the news that we can't seem to shake. And so while I probably wouldn't agree with this young lady's other philosophies of life, her smash your TV and read a book and form your own opinion sign is quite fitting for the day. We watch too much news. I saw the news this morning for the first time, and I can't remember how long, because I'm in a hotel room and I have cable. You don't need to watch the news every day. I can assure you, if something important is happening, somebody will tell you about it. You don't need to watch the news every day. We all saw the American flag torn down from our embassy in Egypt. We saw a black Al-Qaeda flag raised to replace it. We all saw Chris Stevens drugged through the streets in Benghazi. But we didn't see this rally that followed, where they said Benghazi is against terrorism, that Chris Stevens was a friend to all Libyans, that thugs and killers do not represent Islam or the Prophet Muhammad. And some Christians would argue, but he does, it does, it does. And I think Christians should stop telling Muslims what they believe and start asking Muslims what they believe. Like this young Muslim who says, "I am afraid of terrorists too." Guys, Muslims suffer at the hands of terrorists far more than anyone else. Far more than anyone else. And some have even given their life for this country. And we should be very careful about the public narrative.